Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah, amma ba'd. We were reading of the response to the law of kings in Deuteronomy 17 and its association with the prophet like Moses. We will continue reading from page 70. So with these different contexts in mind, it can be seen that there is no conflict between the two passages. It's important to note that even with the correct context in mind for the law of the king in Deuteronomy 17:15, it still does not rule out that Ishmaelites and Edomites being appointed as kings over Israel. The evidence for this can be found in the ancient Jewish commentary Sifri Deuteronomy, which states the following about King Agrippa. When Agrippa came to this verse, he wept, and all the people of Israel said to him, "Fear not, Agrippa, you are our brother. You are our brother." King Agrippa, who was the grandson of Herod, was partly Edomite, and is said to have wept when he read the verse of Deuteronomy 17:15, as he understood it to mean that he was prohibited from being king. The Israelites in his assembly reassured him by telling him that he is their brother, which shows that non-Israelites could be appointed as kings. This is further reflected by the Edomite Othniel, who became the judge of Israel. But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. The Spirit of the Lord came on him, so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. The Lord gave Cushan Rishathaim, king of Aram, into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. Judges chapter 3, verses 9 to 10. Othniel's divinely ordained position as judge over Israel is important in light of Deuteronomy's stance on the appointment of judges. Appoint judges and officials for each of your tribes in every town the Lord your God is giving to you, and they shall judge the people fairly. Deuteronomy 16, verse 18. We can see that Deuteronomy's explicit law restricting the judiciary to the tribes of Israel in no way prohibited the Edomite Othniel from becoming a judge. In summary, all these various evidences show that our interpretation of the prophecy in Deuteronomy 18:15 is in perfect harmony with the correct context of the law of the king in Deuteronomy 17:15. Another objection to the notion of the prophet like Moses being a Gentile is a claim by Christians that the incident between the Pharisees and John the Baptist proves that the coming prophet must be an ethnic Jew. They cite the following conversation from the New Testament. Now this was John's testimony when the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask him who he was. He did not fail to confess, but confessed freely, "I am not the Messiah." They asked him, "Then who are you? Are you Elijah?" He said, "I am not." "Are you the prophet?" He answered, "No." John 1, verses 19 to 21. The argument is that, given that the Pharisees knew that John the Baptist was an ethnic Jew, and given that they had asked him whether he is the prophet, then surely they had the understanding that the coming prophet like Moses must be an ethnic Jew. This conclusion is incorrect for a number of reasons. Firstly, note that the Pharisees also asked John whether he is Elijah. As we covered earlier in chapter 1, Prophet Elijah was not a Jew, but rather a Gentile, possibly an Ishmaelite. Secondly, they also asked him if he is the Messiah. Jews and Christians believe that the Messiah will be of the Davidic line, which is the tribe of Judah, whereas John was the son of Zakariah, who was from the tribe of Levi. All of this demonstrates that John's questioners had no knowledge of his ethnicity or lineage, and they certainly did not have the understanding that he was an ethnic Jew. We certainly should not expect them to have had background knowledge about John, given that the New Testament teaches that he suddenly emerged out of the desert. Another objection that needs to be addressed is the claim that the prophecy is a reference to multiple prophets or a succession of prophets, and not every single prophet. One problem with this interpretation is the fact that the Hebrew word used for prophet in Deuteronomy 18:15 and 18:18 is nabi, which is singular and not plural. Moses says not prophets, but a prophet. Another problem with this interpretation is that the mention of the prophet in Hebrew is in the emphatic. What this means is that the original Hebrew does not read like most English translations, which are rendered as follows: I will raise up for them a prophet like you. In Hebrew, it actually reads as follows: a prophet I will raise up for them. Note that in the original Hebrew, the verse starts with the mention of a prophet. There are some English versions of the Bible which have this more accurate translation. For example, the Darby Bible translation. A prophet will I raise up unto them from among the brethren, like unto thee, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him. Young's literal translation also uses a similar translation. A prophet I raise up to them out of the midst of their brethren, like to thee, and I have given my words in his mouth, and he hath spoken unto them all that which I command him. This is important because the mention of a prophet at the start of the verse emphasizes and stresses the fact that this will be a single prophet who will be sent. The way that the Hebrew is constructed tells us that a very special and specific Moses-like prophet will be sent, not multiple prophets or a succession of prophets. Professor of the Old Testament Walter Kaiser states, this prediction is singular in number throughout this passage. In fact, the word prophet is placed in the emphatic position in front of the Hebrew verb in verse 15 and 18. Clearly, a single person is intended here. End quote. An important point is that at the time the prophecy of the coming prophet like Moses was spoken, God had already sent the Israelites a line of prophets after Moses, including Aaron and Miriam. Then Miriam, the prophet, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women followed her with timbrels and dancing. Exodus 15, verse 20. Yet, the prophecy implies a future event that has not yet occurred. I will raise up. So, given the line of succession had already commenced with the likes of the prophets Aaron and Miriam, it would be nonsensical for God to then go on to reveal a prophecy informing the Israelites about something that had already taken place. Clearly, the prophecy about the coming prophet like Moses must be a unique future event that is very different to the line of succession of prophets that Israel was already witnessing. One final objection which needs to be addressed is that raised by Christians who argue that the New Testament explicitly applies the prophecy of Deuteronomy 18:18 to Jesus. One example cited is the transfiguration story found in the Synoptic Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud. This is my Son, whom I love. Listen to him. Mark 9, verse 7. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. Matthew 17, verse 5. A voice came from the cloud saying, This is my Son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him. Luke 9:35. Here all three transfiguration accounts in the Synoptic Gospels contain the instruction, Listen to him, an allusion to the prophecy in Deuteronomy 18, in which God warns the Israelites about not listening to the words he will put in the mouth of the coming prophet like Moses. I myself will call to account anyone who does not listen to the words that the prophet speaks in my name. Deuteronomy 18, verse 19. Note that the account in Matthew above contains the unique statement, With him I am well pleased. This is an allusion to another prophecy that can be found in the book of Isaiah. Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom I delight. Isaiah 42, verse 1. Now there are some serious textual issues with these synoptic accounts. First, the accounts in Mark and Luke are both missing the allusion to Isaiah 42, which calls into question the reliability of Matthew's allusion to Isaiah 42. Second issue emerges when we compare the synoptic transfiguration accounts to that in the second epistle of Peter. He received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came to him from the majestic glory, saying, This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 17. Note that the passage above contains the allusion to Isaiah 42, but is missing the allusion to Deuteronomy 18, verse 19. We can see that among the 4 transfiguration accounts in Mark, Matthew, Luke, and Peter, there is significant confusion as to which exact words were spoken by God. Yet another issue emerges when we consider the fact that the prophecy in Deuteronomy 18 has God promising the Israelites that they would never again hear his voice. For this is what you asked of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, Let us not hear the voice of the Lord our God, nor see this great fire any more, or we will die. The Lord said to me, What they say is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites, and I will put my words into his mouth. He will tell them everything I command him. Deuteronomy 18, verse 16, 17, and 18. The context of the prophecy makes it clear that when this prophet like Moses emerges, the Israelites will not hear the voice of the Lord publicly again as they did at Horeb. Yet, according to the transfiguration accounts in Mark, Matthew, Luke, and Peter, God publicly declared his love for Jesus. This violates the whole context of the prophecy in Deuteronomy 18, which tells us that the Israelites were not supposed to hear the voice of God again. Instead, his words will be put in the mouth of the prophet like Moses. In summary, these transfiguration accounts in Mark, Matthew, Luke, and Peter contain a variety of textual issues which cast doubt on their reliability. Another New Testament passage cited by Christians that they claim applies the prophecy of Deuteronomy 18:18 to Jesus can be found in the book of Acts, in which the Apostle Peter says of Jesus, Repent therefore and turn again, that your sins may be blotted out, that times of refreshing may come from the presence of the Lord, and that he may send the Christ appointed for you, Jesus, whom heaven must receive until the time for establishing all that God spoke by the mouth of his holy prophets from old. Moses said, The Lord God will raise up for you a prophet from your brethren as he raised me up. You shall listen to him in whatever he tells you. Acts chapter 3, 19-22. The first thing to note is that while Peter does indeed quote the prophecy from Deuteronomy 18:18, it does not explicitly identify Jesus as its fulfillment. Here, Peter's words can quite reasonably be understood to mean that Jesus is waiting in heaven until the foretold prophet like Moses emerges in the world, not that Jesus is the same person as the prophet like Moses. Now, if, for the sake of argument, we go along with the interpretation that Peter is identifying Jesus as the prophet like Moses, then it means that the prophecy remains unfulfilled today because Jesus is still in heaven, just as he was when Peter spoke the above words. The Bible scholar Howard M. Teeple comments as follows with regards to Acts 3:22. The preceding verse in Acts states that heaven has received Jesus until the times of the restoration of all things. This indicates that the author is identifying Jesus' second advent with new Mosaic times when the former conditions will be restored. End quote. A big problem worth highlighting when it comes to such claims of New Testament passages applying the prophecy of Deuteronomy 18:18 to Jesus is that among the Gospels there is clear disagreement as to whether Jesus really is the prophet like Moses. This shall be illustrated by comparing the Gospels of Matthew and John, with the former going out of its way to make Jesus appear like Moses, and the latter going out of its way to make the point that Jesus is unlike Moses. Let us begin with the following account in Matthew's Gospel. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said. Take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, Out of Egypt I called my son. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Matthew 2, verses 13-16. Note the statement, and so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, Out of Egypt I called my son. According to Matthew, there is a prophecy in the Old Testament that was fulfilled by Jesus. But when one goes back to the book of Hosea in the Old Testament, where the passage is referenced from, you will find that only half the passage has been quoted. When Israel was a child, then I loved him, and called my son out of Egypt. Hosea 11, verse 1. As you can see when read in full, rather than being a prophecy about Jesus, this verse was in fact speaking of a past event, the exodus of the Israelites at the time of Moses. So, Matthew's gospel was clearly twisting Old Testament passages out of their original context in order to make them fit Jesus. There is also a chronological issue in the passage above. Matthew has an angel warn Joseph about an impending massacre by King Herod, who sought to kill the young male children. Joseph and Mary are then said to have fled to Egypt with Jesus, who at the time was a young child. The problem with this narrative is that the Gospel of Luke states that Jesus was born after King Herod died. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that the census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. Luke 2, verses 1 to 5. Here, Luke has a pregnant Mary at the time of a Roman census that is said to have taken place when Quirinius, I'm not sure how to say that, Quirinius? Yeah, it sounds right, was governor of Syria. Historically, Quirinius became governor in the year 6 CE, nearly a decade after King Herod had died, according to most scholars. Hence, Matthew contradicted Luke, where he claimed Jesus was a young child during the reign of King Herod. The situation can be easily explained by understanding that Matthew changed the biography of Jesus in order to place him as a young child during the reign of King Herod so that he could draw parallels between Jesus and Moses. In the same way that a young Moses was threatened by Pharaoh's massacre of the Israelite children in Egypt, so too was a young Jesus threatened by King Herod's massacre. In the next example of Matthew making Jesus more Moses-like is the following passage. Next, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. Matthew 5, verses 1 to 2. Here, Matthew has Jesus ascend a mountainside in order to deliver the famous Sermon on the Mount. Contrast this account with that of Luke's Gospel, which has Jesus deliver the sermon not on a mountain, but rather a level plain. He went down with them and stood on a level place. Luke 6, verse 17. Which is the correct setting of the sermon then? The mountain of Matthew or the level plain of Luke? Many scholars believe that Matthew changed the setting to a mountain in order to make Jesus mirror the actions of Moses ascending Mount Sinai. See Exodus 19, verse 20. The Bible scholar Howard M. Teeple confirms this view. In one portion of this sermon, Matthew 5, verses 21 to 48, Jesus is indeed presented as a new Moses, but a new Moses in the sense that he gives a reinterpretation of the Torah, not that he replaces it. This is not a faithful record of the words of Jesus, but is a production of the author of Matthew, who has expanded and revised the Sermon on the Plain in Luke 6, along with some other Q traditions. This is shown to be the case by a comparison of this section of the Sermon on the Mount with the original Sermon on the Plain, in which Jesus is not a new Moses. Thus, the Sermon on the Mount is evidence not that Jesus regarded himself as a new Moses, but that the author of Matthew portrayed himself as such. End quote. In summary, a few examples of Matthew's Gospel molding Jesus to be more Moses-like have been presented, going so far as to fabricate his biography and misapplying Old Testament passages by taking them out of their original context. Now let's turn our attention to John's Gospel to see the opposite agenda at play, with the author going out of their way to make Jesus unlike Moses. In multiple passages, the Messiah is identified as a person who is distinct from the prophet like Moses. See John 1, 19 to 21, and 24 and 25. We even find an example where Jesus is said to have been foretold by Moses, but then Rather than going on to confirm that Jesus is the prophet like Moses of Deuteronomy 18, it calls him the King of Israel, which is another title for the Messiah. See John 1, verses 45 to 49. There is even a passage where Jesus as a grace giver is contrasted with Moses as a lawgiver. See John 1, verse 17. This is noteworthy. Recall earlier that one of the defining characteristics of the prophet like Moses was identified as there being a lawgiver. Howard M. Teeple confirms, the attitude that Christ is superior to Moses underlies the fourth gospel too. The law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Christ. John 1, verse 17. In John 6, 31, 32, and 33, it was not Moses who gave the bread from heaven. Instead, the Father gives the true bread from heaven, which, in the following verses, is held to be the body of Christ in the Eucharist. This is a rejection of the belief that Jesus is the new Moses. End quote. There's also a situation where some people refer to Jesus as a prophet like Moses, but rather than confirm this title, Jesus instead withdraws to a mountain by himself. John 6, 14 to 15. Moreover, in other passages, there are situations where groups of people argue over whether Jesus is the Messiah or prophet like Moses, again implying that they are two distinct individuals. See John 7, verses 40 to 41. There is a noteworthy passage where Jesus, who was a Galilean, was rejected as a prophet by the Pharisees, because according to them, Scripture states that no prophet comes out of Galilee. See John 7, verse 52. Some manuscripts even have the reading, the prophet will not come from Galilee, which makes it explicit that the prophet like Moses cannot come from Galilee. Finally, Jesus himself states that the prophet like Moses will come after him in the prophecy about the Paraclete. See John 16, verse 13. In this prophecy, Jesus says that God will send an individual referred to as the Paraclete, who will speak only what he hears and will tell you what is yet to come, a clear allusion to Deuteronomy 18, verses 18 to 22. Since the Paraclete is the prophet like Moses who will be sent after Jesus, then Jesus and the prophet like Moses are obviously two separate individuals. Taking all these examples into consideration, it's apparent that throughout John's Gospel, there is a consistent pattern of Jesus being unlike Moses, which stands in stark contrast to Matthew's Gospel, which, as we have seen, went out of its way to mold Jesus into the figure of Moses, falsifying Jesus' biography and misapplying Old Testament prophecy along the way. So any claims that the New Testament reliably identifies Jesus as the prophet like Moses is far from accurate. Finally, although technically speaking, what follows is not an objection to any arguments that we have made in this chapter, there is a Christian interpretation of Exodus 23 that is worth briefly tackling. Behold, I am sending an angel before you to protect you along the way and to bring you to the place I have prepared. Pay attention to him and listen to his voice. Do not defy him, for he will not forgive rebellion, since my name is in him. And I have set thy border from the Red Sea even unto the sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness unto the river. For I give into your hand the inhabitants of the land, and thou hast cast them out from before thee. Exodus 23, verses 20 to 21, and verse 31. Recall from earlier in this chapter, we saw that this prophecy is related to Deuteronomy 18:18 and was never fulfilled by Moses during his lifetime because God became angry at the sins of the Israelites. As a punishment, God prevented Moses and the Israelites from entering the land which was promised to them. Because this prophecy mentions an angel having the name of God in him, some Christians interpret this to be a reference to the divine angelic Jesus. Now, there are a few issues with such an interpretation. Mainly, the New Testament explicitly applies the prophecy to John the Baptist. See Luke 7, verse 27, as we covered earlier. Note that earlier, we also refuted the possibility that it refers to John the Baptist. But for the sake of the discussion, we are going with the New Testament interpretation because it is scripturally binding on Christians for whom it should rule out the alternative interpretation of a divine angelic Jesus. Moreover, the word translated as angel is the Hebrew malach, which simply means messenger. It can be a reference to a human messenger or an angelic being, depending on the context. So, the prophecy above could be translated as, "Behold, I am sending a messenger before you." Haggai, for example, is called both a prophet and God's Malak. See Haggai 1:1 and 1:13. In which case, the Malak here could be understood to be a reference to Prophet Moses. Christians may argue that Malak in this context could be understood as a divine being due to the prophecy mentioning that the Malak will not forgive rebellion, which relates to the forgiveness of sin. Only God can pardon sin, which rules out Moses, who was a human being. Looking at the immediate context, it becomes clear that this is not the case, as the prophecy is speaking of obedience to the Malak's voice and not being rebellious towards him. So, the statement could be understood to mean that the Malak would not put up with rebellion, and consequently would stop protecting the Israelites and not fulfill the prophecy of leading them to the promised land if they disobeyed his voice. Lastly, Christians may argue that Moses cannot be the Malak, given the fact that their prophecy is speaking about the Malak while addressing the Malak. In other words, why would God tell Moses that he is sending Moses to deliver the Israelites into the promised land? It makes far more sense that he is informing Moses that he will send a third party, such as a divine angelic Jesus. In response, God is speaking to the Israelites in the first person. The passage can reasonably be understood as a prophecy that Moses is to relay to the Israelites. God's words are to the Israelites, not to Moses. This chapter now comes to a close. In conclusion, it has established herein that the prophet, like Moses, foretold in Deuteronomy 18:18, will have the following qualities. Firstly, he will be a lawgiver. Secondly, he will not be from among the Israelites. Rather, he will be a descendant of a Gentile nation that is closely related to the Israelites, such as the Ishmaelites or the Edomites. He will not be sent immediately. Rather, he will be sent after Moses at some unspecified time in the future. These findings rule out Joshua, Jesus, and in fact, all Israelite prophets as candidates for the coming prophet foretold in Deuteronomy 18:18. So, just who is this future prophet from the Gentiles who is similar to Moses, who God proclaimed would be sent to the world? In the next chapter, we will look to further prophecies in the Bible, which indicate it can be none other than Muhammad, upon whom be peace, the Arabian prophet sent to the whole of mankind. Got about 12 more minutes, so I'll get somewhat into chapter 3. Maybe I can do 5 or so pages, insha'Allah. Chapter 3, the Arabian prophecies. In this chapter, we are going to look at compelling examples of Bible prophecies that foretell the coming of a prophet in Arabia, and why Muhammad is the only individual in history that fulfills them. Although there are numerous prophecies about Muhammad scattered throughout the Bible, our discussion is going to focus primarily on the Old Testament books of Deuteronomy 33, Isaiah 42, and Psalm 84. The prophecy in Deuteronomy 33. The book of Deuteronomy mentions a prophecy given by Moses foretelling the emergence of multitudes of saints and a fiery law from Arabia. And this is the blessing wherewith Moses, the man of God, blessed the children of Israel before his death. The Lord came from Sinai, and rose up from Seir unto them. He shined forth from Mount Paran, and he came with 10,000s of saints. From his right hand went a fiery law for them. Deuteronomy 33, verses 1 to 2. We're now going to see how the details and sequence of the verses point to this being a reference to the three Abrahamic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This prophecy can be divided into two parts. Firstly, the mention of Sinai, Seir, and Paran. And then, secondly, the emergence of 10,000 saints and a law. We will now discuss each of these in detail. The mention of Sinai, Seir, and Paran. The Lord came from Sinai and rose up from Seir unto them. He shined forth from Mount Paran. Here, one can see clearly that three locations are mentioned. Sinai is the location where Moses encountered God and received the Ten Commandments, as is indicated by the statement, the Lord came from Sinai. Seir is an allusion to Palestine, as Mount Seir was situated within the ancient kingdom of Edom, which was in Palestine. This is according to the commentators of the Old Testament. Seir is the mountain land of the Edomites to the east of Sinai. Palestine is where Jesus appeared with a call to God. The Lord rose up from Seir. It's important to acknowledge the Jewish interpretation that Jesus is not the Messiah. However, regardless of who one interprets the Messiah to be, even Jewish sources themselves acknowledge that Edom is associated with the Messiah. The Midrash is an ancient Jewish commentary on Hebrew scriptures. The following Midrash associates the Messiah with Edom. And just as the Holy One, blessed is he, said to Hiram, Ezekiel 28, verse 18, I have brought fire from within you, it will consume you. Similarly, the daughter of Pharaoh raised the one who would punish her father in the future, and even the anointed king that is destined to punish Edom sits among them in their own province, as it says, Isaiah 27, verse 10, there shall the calf, the Messiah, graze, and there lie down and destroy its branches. The big question is, which location is being referenced to in the final part of this prophecy, which proclaims he shined forth from Mount Paran? While biblical geographers differ as to the exact location of Paran, they are, however, unanimous that Paran is located somewhere within Arabia. From Clarke's commentary on the Bible, he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran. This is generally allowed to have been a part of the desert belonging to Arabia Petraea, in the vicinity of Mount Sinai, and this seems to be its uniform meaning in the sacred writings. Strong's Hebrew Dictionary also tells us that Paran is a desert of Arabia. H6290, Paran from H6286, ornamental, Paran, a desert of Arabia. That is Paran. Cebios, a 7th century Armenian bishop and historian, when describing the Arab conquest of his time, wrote that the Arabs assembled and came out from Paran. Encyclopedia Biblica, edited by Reverend T.K. Cheney, asserts Paran refers to the Arab tribal names, Faran or Faran. End quote. The Bible tells us that Paran is the very place where Ishmael dwelt. While he, Ishmael, was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt, Genesis 21:21. The Bible also tells us that Abraham sent Ishmael eastward. Abraham left everything he owned to Isaac, but while he was still living, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them away from his son Isaac to the land of the east, Genesis 25, verses 5 to 6. The concubines mentioned here is a reference to Hagar and Keturah, with Hagar being the mother of Ishmael. The Jamieson Fawcett Brown commentary explains that east is a reference to Arabia. Abraham gave all that he had unto Isaac, unto the sons of the concubines. Abraham gave gifts. While the chief part of the inheritance went to Isaac, the other sons, Ishmael included, migrated to the east country, that is, Arabia, but received each a portion of the patrimony. Likewise, the Barnes Notes on the Bible explains, the east is a general name for Arabia, which stretched away to the southeast and east of the point where Abraham resided in the south of Palestine. End quote. Another evidence that Paran is in Arabia is the fact that Ishmael himself has been associated with Arabia in early Jewish and Christian sources that predate Islam. For example, the Palestinian Talmud states the following: 80,000 apprentice priests fled to the army of Nebuchadnezzar, and they went to the Ishmaelites. They said to them, give us something to drink, for we are thirsty. They brought them salty things and skins, that is, bottles, that were blown up with air. They said to them, eat and drink. When one of them opened a skin and put it to his mouth, the air that was in it burst forth and choked him, as it is written, the oracle concerning Arabia. End quote. The Babylonian Talmud likewise states, the one who sees Ishmael in a dream his prayer will be heard. End of Baraita. And only Ishmael, the son of Abraham, but an Arab in general, no. The one who sees a camel in a dream, death has been decreed upon him from heaven, and he has been saved from it. End quote. The 1st century Jewish historian Josephus wrote, 8 days later, they promptly circumcise him, and from that time forward, the Jewish practice has been to circumcise so many days after birth. The Arabs defer the ceremony to the 13th year, because Ishmael, the founder of their race, one of Abraham's concubine, was circumcised at that age. End quote. The 5th century church historian Salminius Hermias Sozomenus describes the Arabs as descendants of Ishmael, who, due to the influence of their pagan neighbors, had corrupted the old discipline of their ancestor Abraham. He even knew of a certain group among the Arab descendants of Ishmael who eventually came into contact with Hebrews, and by learning from them resumed the original Abrahamic religion. In light of these early Jewish and Christian sources that explicitly associated Ishmael with Arabia, and given that we earlier established that Paran is associated with Ishmael, we can conclude that Paran is therefore associated with Arabia via the common link of Ishmael. This abundance of evidence all points to the conclusion that the Paran, or Pharan, of Ishmael was certainly in the Arabian Peninsula. In fact, we can narrow this location down further. Modern academic research supports the claim that Ishmael's Paran was indeed in reference to a specific part of Arabia known as Hijaz, modern-day western Saudi Arabia. Irfan Shahid, one of the world's most renowned authorities on pre-Islamic ancient Arabian geography and history, stated that there was a place called Pharan in Hijaz, which belonged to the Sulaim tribe. The Book of Jubilees is an ancient Jewish text dated to at least 100 BCE. It also points to Paran being the region of western Saudi Arabia based on its geographic descriptions of the migration of Ishmael. And Ishmael and his sons, and the sons of Keturah and their sons, went together and dwelt from Paran to the entering in of Babylon, and all the land which is towards the east facing the desert. And these mingled with each other, and their name was called Arabs and Ishmaelites. Book of Jubilees 20, verses 12 to 13. We are told that Ishmael and his sons dwelt with Keturah's descendants. They are said to have intermingled together and acquired the name Ishmaelite and Arab. Note the geographic description of their location. Haran, to the entering in of Babylon, and all the land which is towards the east, facing the desert. Ishmael's descendants are said to occupy land stretching from Paran to the entry of Babylon, which, towards the east, faces the desert. The entry of Babylon was located in southern Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq. This represents a region that forms a sort of upside-down L shape that faces the desert of Arabia. You can see that there should be on the screen there a map. We can see that Hijaz, modern-day western Saudi Arabia, perfectly fits the geographic description of Paran in the Book of Jubilees. In summary, we have seen that the first portion of the prophecy highlights the advent of three important individuals: Moses in Sinai, Jesus in Palestine, and a third figure in western Saudi Arabia. It's time for Maghrib, so I've got to go. Thank you for joining. It's nice to see you here, Proving Islam. Assalamu alaikum.